what the ancient people faced, and we still face it nowadays, but we have already solutions to the dilemma, to the issues that were faced by the people in antiquity, is dizzying, overwhelming variety of things around us. Just have a very short glimpse at around you. Even though it is a very Swedish, sterile, puritanic environment, there are still things around you, tables and chairs, even though it is the IKEA furniture, but there is some variety. Maybe not as rich variety as somewhere, in Africa or in the Caribbean region, but still a variety. So imagine ancient people facing a very similar situation of having this huge variety of things around them and not being able to know what to do with them. Should they name them, all of them, like one by one? If you take like a chair just next to you, it may have a name. So if you want to indicate this chair, to share your experience about this chair with your friends, you have to name it. So should you have a separate word for each chair around you? Should you have a separate word for each tree around you if you are somewhere in the forest? Should you have a separate name, separate word for any single thing, any single grass, flower, bird, a rabbit that you see? It's really a challenge. Just think about this. It's not that simple that it appears to be. Things around you, they are many. And you need to share your experience about those things somehow with your peers. And how do you do this? You essentially have to invent a word for each thing. Just following, the biblical story about Adam, who was called, and Adam and Eve, who were called to name things, right? And that was not a simple task. They had to choose words, and they had to decide to name things, each of them, or in bunches, in groups. The only way for a human mind, unless this mind is really a mind of a genius who can hold all those multiple things in one head and name them each by its own word, we are limited in our capacities. Some scholars I just recently read calculated that our brain can hold like several terabytes of information, whatever. I don't know whether it is true or not, but it means anyways that our capacities are limited. We cannot have names, words for each thing around us. And it means that we need to generalize. We need to extract some commonalities from all those things. And those commonalities have to be named. That is a much easier task, to name fewer things which are commonalities. But this task comes at a price. We need to extract commonalities. We need to identify what is common and what is different between the things that we observe. So yes, we may have one word for all trees around us in the forest, but we need to, which is much easier for us to comprehend, to operate. But we have at the same time to identify what is a tree. What are the commonalities of that tree? And that is basically the function of the language. The purpose of the language is not just to name things, but also to generalize things, to extract, to identify those commonalities between the things that surround us. And that is the function of the language from its very beginning. So the first language that the people spoke, whatever it was, we in the Orthodox Church many of us believe that it was the Greek language which was spoken in the paradise, and Adam and Eve spoke. I just came from Saudi Arabia, and many people there believe that that is the Arabic language, which is also the language of the Quran, which is uncreated for many and was sent from God in Arabic. So even in whether it is Arabic or Greek or maybe Swedish, who knows, that first language already contained this mechanism of generalizing, of extracting commonalities from the things that we observe, the things around us. And basically, all the words in the vocabulary of any language is nothing more but commonalities, with only maybe a few exceptions and some special category of words in all those languages. So whether it is the word tree, nouns like tree, dog, a human being, a star, a city, anything, any word you take, it's a commonality, it's a generalization, it's a result of this process of extracting commonalities from this distinct variety of things that surround us. Probably the only category that does not fit exactly this role is the category of names in the languages. And even though names, yes, they are common, there are millions of Johns or Jacks or Sarahs and so forth in our languages, still we try to make as specific as possible in identifying persons and attach those name tags to the persons. That's why we have, like recently the humanity invented surnames. Before that, there were the places of their provenance, like Leonardo da Vinci, meaning a Leonardo. There were many Leonardos at the time, but there were a few from Vinci, from the village of Vinci. And the humanity tried to be as specific as possible, as specific as possible in narrowing, the language to identify a particular being or a particular person by a name. And this applied not just to human beings, it applied to animals like dogs, and we now have fancy names for our pets. Probably there were always names for pets. We don't know exactly, it's not very much recorded in the history, but we may assume. Also names for cities, also, and even if they named cities in commonality, like there were like dozens of Alexandrias in the ancient world, not just the Alexandria that we know in Egypt, but really dozens of Alexandrias established by Alexander the Great. The Greeks still specified what kind of Alexandria it was, like Alexandria Neschatis somewhere in Afghanistan nowadays, or it's Alexandria in Egypt, the Alexandria that we know, the kind of prototypical. So people try to specify what kind of thing it was. Or just in concurrence with this, just an example of like books. We have millions of books around us, and we try to be as specific as possible in identifying those books. That's why each book has its cover, each book has its title, which tends to be unique, and we need to check, especially those who publish books, they need first, before titling their book, they need to check out if there are no other titles like that published already. So we need to be as specific in making our publication as unique as possible. Just an example, I just brought an example for you. Those are, like two books that I wanted to show you by Stephen Fry. Probably you know this. One is those are two books about Greek mythology and ancient history. One is mythos and another one is heroes. Right? So they have several commonalities, like they are similar in their shape. They've been published by the same publisher, which is Penguins. They have the same author. They are designed in the same way. They look like similar with those circles. They even have the same kind of offer: buy one get one half price. You know, it's also a commonality between them. I purchased them in London, I think, in Heathrow Airport on my way to Greece. So they offer those kind of things. But still, they are different because they have different titles, Mythos and Heroes, and they are different in the design of their covers. So we are dealing here with different degrees of commonalities and particularities, and this play with different degrees of commonalities and particularities is important for our mind, for our language, and for our civilization. Essentially, our civilization, if you want, is built around those degrees of commonalities and particularities. Our languages are structured around the commonalities, as I said from the beginning, but they also structured around the degrees of commonalities and particularities. There are more common commonalities and there are more particular commonalities. Like the more common commonality between these two books is that they are books. There is an even kind of there is a more particular commonality between these books. The author, Stephen Fry, he has authored other books, actually quite a few. And these books share commonality with those books published by Stephen Fry, but which were not published by this publisher in this series. There is a more particular commonality between these books. They belong to the same series, published by the same publisher. And it is the series which consists of two, actually, books on the Greek mythology. And eventually, these books have an even more particular commonality, which is their titles. Well, I don't know how many copies of this book have been published, but still there are copies of each book, right? It's not the unique book that I have. Therefore, the kind of a more particular but still commonality between these books is the title of this book. Like Mythos and Heroes. This title makes this book different from this book. But there are some other books with this title, which are common with this book. Finally, the ultimate particularity of each thing that we have is this particular thing that I hold in my hands. This is as real as possible. This is as particular as possible that you can get. This unique book, which cannot be repeated, which is different from any other book, even the same book with the same title, but there are some differences, like differences in the weight of this. Maybe it's heavier or lighter by 1 gram than other books. I don't know. It certainly has like spills. It has like scratches, which makes this particular book unique. And this ultimate particularity of each book is kind of a special category that I'm going to explain a bit later. So my point here, as of now, is that we live in the world of many things, of multiple things, and we try to manage this multiplicity, primarily owing to the limitations of our mind, of our brain. We cannot hold all those many billions, zillions, name it. I mean, the mathematicians know those, names for countless zeros. Things around us. Probably only God holds all those, things in his mind without need to generalize them. But we cannot. And that is probably one of the basic differences between human beings and God. God holds everything, every single being, in his mind in a unique way and completely. We cannot do that. We can only generalize, and that's how our brain functions, and that's how language functions. And essentially, my second point is that our language, our culture, including intellectual culture, our philosophy, and our theology operates both commonalities and particularities and the variety, all those 50 shadows of commonalities between them. Sorry for my language. Meaning there is this huge variety of the degrees of commonalities and particularities between, the ultimate commonality and the ultimate particularity. The ultimate commonality for this book is just any book, the idea of bookness. The ultimate particularity of this book is this book as such, per se. Right? And there is, as I said, a variety of more particular commonalities or more common particularities, as you wish, which just exists as a gamut between this particular thing and the idea of the books as such. I mentioned the concept of idea, not coincidentally, because probably one of the earliest philosophers who introduced this idea of commonality and particularity was Plato. If you take the Platonic idea of idea, actually, again, sorry for the play of words, it seems that we cannot escape using Plato's language to describe Plato's language. And it's inevitable, so we use it. And what I want to say is that the Plato's idea of idea is actually a word for commonality. That's how Plato faced this challenge of generalizing things. Plato essentially suggested that yes, there is a huge variety of things here in this world that surround us. At the same time, he based himself, of course, on the observations of his predecessors like pre-Socratics and others. It seems to be a long tradition. And again, as I said, any language, even the most barbarian language, even the most unsophisticated, unphilosophical language you can imagine, that language contains implicitly this differentiation between particularity and commonality. And Plato, what he did, he just conceptualized this idea, this basic instinct of every language. And he suggested that, yes, the commonalities do exist. The commonalities do exist not just in language. They are realities that hover like above this world. They exist in the realm of the divine. Contrary to what I just recently said that God holds every single thing in his mind, Plato suggested that no, God does not hold all those things in his mind. He holds ideas. God, or the divine, well, probably Plato believed in one God somehow, but he certainly believed in many gods. And he differentiated between the sphere of the divine and the sphere of the human, of the mortal. And he believed that this world is just a reflection, as you know, of the ideas above it. And he called those ideas above it ideas. That is his word for it. And essentially, he called by ideas the commonalities that we experience in everyday life. So the Platonic ideas is nothing more than the commonalities that we experience and we try to extract from the multiplicity of things around us. The only thing that Plato did, he ascribed those commonalities to the sphere of the divine. He believed that the commonalities are divine and the particularities are not divine. They belong to this world. They are of of worse quality, as it were. And since Plato, it has become a common kind of point in the Platonic philosophy that commonality is something superior to particularity. Because commonality is the divine ideas that are above us. Just as the world of ideas is superior to the world that we live in, according to Plato, in the same sense, commonalities are superior to particularities. Of course, it goes contrary to our modern culture, because our modern culture values more particularity, specificity, uniqueness of each and every one than what is common among us. Well, I don't need to explain this to you. I think it is obvious from the modern culture that, yes, which tells you, be unique, be unlike others, be different. To be different is great, is excellent. And this is exactly a point that values. It means that the modern culture values more particularity than it does value commonality. And this is the kind of one of the basic differences between modern culture and Platonic culture, the ancient Greek culture, which valued much more commonality than particularity. Okay, any questions so far? I hope everything is more or less clear, and I generalize, produce as clear commonalities as possible about commonalities, right? Yes, Daniel, please. Exactly. As particularities, yes, commonalities emanate into particularities. Yes. Yes. Exactly. Exactly. Yes, exactly. And this is exactly, you are very right that this is a hierarchy. But when Plato described this hierarchy, he did not structure it as a hierarchy. It came up later. It came up in the works of Plato's kind of followers, Neoplatonists. Neoplatonists developed and perfected this model of commonalities and particularities to a much great extent, and they made it very explicit that the world of ideas and the world down here where we live, the world of commonalities and the world of particularities, they are not equal. There is a hierarchy between the two worlds, and they produced very fine, elaborated hierarchies to explain the relationship between the commonalities and particularities. And essentially, if you take the concept of hierarchy per se, the concept of hierarchy which had been produced by the Neoplatonists, like Porphyry of Tyre, was among the first who actually introduced the word hierarchia into the vocabulary, modern vocabulary. This idea has to do primarily with the relationship between the commonalities and particularities. Hierarchy has to do with what is more common and what is more particular. And hierarchy's structure, particularities and commonalities. And according to the Platonic and Neoplatonic hierarchism, commonalities are above the particularities. It's if you imagine like a triangle. Let me just draw a triangle for you. Just give me a second. I'm going to draw a triangle of kind of hierarchy for the Platonic school. So this is the triangle that they imagined. On the top of the triangle, as you see, it's like it's a reversed triangle with a kind of top angle on the bottom of this hierarchy. So on the top of this triangle would be commonalities. Like commonalities / ideas. And on the bottom, at the bottom of this triangle, would be the particularities, things. Like here, particularities / things. And in between, there is a variety of different, more common particularities or more particular commonalities here in between. And essentially, the upper, the more general, the more common a thing would go up, the more that thing or that being would have value. The ultimate value would belong to the ultimate commonality, to the ultimate kind of, in the Neoplatonic philosophy, it would be like the one from which everything emanates. All the particularities, if you remember the hierarchies in the Neoplatonic, like in Plotinus, the hierarchies of emanation, you remember that there is one thing and then the one, and then different kind of pairs of forces of things emanate from that one. So the one becomes less common, more particular, and the more particular the one becomes, the lower it descends down here. Okay, so the hierarchy is important in the Platonic and Neoplatonic, especially Neoplatonic thinking regarding commonalities and particularities. But we jumped from Plato to Neoplatonism, and we skipped a very important person, probably the most important person, philosopher, in elaborating on commonalities and particularities, and that is Aristotle. Aristotle is actually the father of any philosophy, any thinking about commonalities and particularities. He actually did as no one else ever in the world in elaborating on those categories. And this is essentially the basis of the Aristotelian philosophy. It's a philosophy of taxonomies. It's a philosophy of sorting things out, of putting them to the shelves of the categories. And actually, Aristotle called those shelves categories, categoria. That is the title of his treatise. Maybe he himself did not kind of title this treatise like that, but this is the title of his most famous treatise, which is called Categoria, and it is called like that because it describes exactly the categories, meaning the shelves of the beings where Aristotle tried to put all things around him. This included human beings, this included, human nations, this included animals, plants, physical phenomena, everything that Aristotle observed, he tried to sort out into categories. And essentially, the entire corpus of his works, all his treatises, are just, different departments in the shelves, in the in categorization of particularities. Imagine, maybe, I don't know if you remember all those old libraries in the universities before the computer era, where they had huge shelves with small cells with cards, library cards. Remember that. So essentially they were structured like that. There were, those walls of shelves, right? And they had same levels, like you draw out kind of a cell on the same level. So essentially it was structured like a grid. Many shelves, and they all were like, they had those horizontal layers, and you just drew out the cell, and you removed, you took your card you wanted. So essentially what Aristotle did, he produced all those countless bookshelves with cards, with library cards, and essentially he placed all of them on different levels. For zoology, for anthropology, for botanics, for physics, even for metaphysics. We will be talking about this right now. So essentially, all his treatises is like a huge library's card shelf, card box for cards, library cards, structured, according to commonalities and particularities within each field. The world of animals, plants, human beings, and so forth. Well, except God, except the divine. That is something that Aristotle tried not to touch. And he made a point out of it. He saw the obsession as he saw it. He saw it as an obsession of Plato with the divine. And he got the Plato's point that Plato wanted essentially to categorize the world of ideas, which meant to categorize the world of the divine, God, or the gods themselves. Aristotle tried to avoid it. He tried to demonstrate that all those commonalities, well, they may do something with the divine, with gods, but essentially they are intrinsic. They are innate in this world. They are a part of this world. It's not that this world is just, a bleak copy, a bad copy of the world, of the categories above, of the ideas. No, Aristotle's point was the categories are here in this world. The commonalities, they belong to this world. They don't belong to that world only. They belong to this world, and they structure this world. They underpin all those particularities that surround us. And Aristotle also ingeniously captured this idea that the commonalities constitute the core of any language. And he described the commonalities and particularities through linguistic terms, like the things which are said of. That is his definition of a category. So if we say something common about this book and this book, right? We use the same word, book, for both of them. That is what Aristotle said, this thing said of. And that is the category. That is the commonality that he extracted from these two books. Okay? So essentially, while Plato made categories or commonalities and particularities and the distinction between them and the variety between them of kind of middle things between them, commonalities and particularities, Plato made them a part of metaphysics. Aristotle made them a part of his physics, a part of his looking at this world and distinguishing commonality in this world. Certainly Aristotle's approach was more realistic. Certainly Aristotle's approach was more down to earth, it was more scientific. And that's why Aristotle's categories became the basis of any taxonomy, any generalization in the modern science. That's why Aristotle is believed to be the father of modern science, because the modern science is essentially, basically, nothing more than sorting things out into shelves. Taking a hype of things, mixed up, and then trying to sort out those things, to analyze those things, and set them and put them to their shelves where they belong. If you take, I just want to exemplify this by, the famous Swedish example of Carl Linnaeus. He did nothing more than just apply the Aristotelian concept of commonality and particularity to the realm of animals and plants. In addition of being a great Swede and a great, of course, and a great botanist, he was primarily a great taxonomist. He produced taxonomies. And he did this on the basis of this Aristotelian intuitive perception of the commonalities, that the commonalities belong to this world, they can be discerned, perceived, they can be extracted from the things around us and can be put to a scheme. That's what actually Carl Linnaeus did. So that's a bit about the science, as it were, and it's a bit about the Aristotelian roots of science. Now, what about theology? Well, Carl Linnaeus lived in the world in the time when theology became separate from science, and science emerged as different from theology. And of course, the question which was relevant in the time of Carl Linnaeus, in the early modernity, was whether the scientific methods are applicable to the divine. Well, that is the core of the of this big question of the modernity about the relationship between rationality and faith, ratio and credo, believing and thinking and understanding. There was as you know, a point of view dominant and still important in the modern discourses that believing and thinking, understanding are incompatible. And either you are a rationalist or you are a believer. Either you are a scientist or a theologian. Either you do theology or you do science. And essentially, this is not the dilemma that emerged in the time of Carl Linnaeus in the early modernity. This was exactly the dilemma that emerged in the late antiquity. And this was exactly the dilemma that Neoplatonists faced. And in the time of Neoplatonists, it was about what? It was about applicability of the categories, Aristotelian now categories, because Aristotle was the best. He was kind of the basis for everyone to apply the idea of commonality to the world around us. So for the Neoplatonists, it was the question, are the categories applicable to the realm of the divine? Is it possible to generalize, as we do regarding, plants and trees and stones and cities and human beings, is it possible to apply this kind of generalization to God or to gods? Well, for the Neoplatonists, it was easier to answer this question because they had Plato behind their shoulders. And Plato had applied this differentiation between commonality and particularity even before Aristotle, as we said, through the concept of ideas, through the idea of idea. That idea was the commonality for Plato, and it belonged to the divine. So for the Neoplatonists, it was easy to apply the concept of commonality to the divine. Moreover, for the Neoplatonists, the concept of commonality and particularity helped to further the polytheistic theology. What is my point? What I want to say? Neoplatonists, in contrast to what many believe about them nowadays, were very much devoted people. They are very religious. Neoplatonism coincided, or probably it embodied, a wave of a kind of religious awakening in the 2nd, 3rd century AD not just among Christians. We're not talking about Christians who constituted a tiny minority at the time. We're talking about the majority of the pagans, of polytheists. And they were not secular at all, even though they were philosophers. Well, in contrast to modern perception of philosophers, the Neoplatonic philosophers were very much devoted. And they were devoted to every detail of the pagan rite. They really, really liked, sacrificing. They really enjoyed, cutting throats of goats and sheep. They really liked, burning their meat on the altars. And they meant it. If you take, the most famous Neoplatonic philosophers like Porphyry, he really was into the, pagan rite. And they believed in gods. Not just, in the concept of the one. They did believe in the one, but they also believed in many gods. And, they prayed to Zeus, to Aphrodite or Venus. They really dedicated, things and gifts to them. And they wanted to make sense of them. And essentially, Neoplatonic philosophy, this taxonomization of commonalities and particularities, helped them to sort out gods. So essentially, they created hierarchies of gods, and they created more common and more particular divinities. So the this scientific method of generalization, of taxonomization, was applied by the Neoplatonists to the divine, to theology. Theology became the Neoplatonic theology, which was pagan, which was polytheistic. It was based essentially on the concepts of commonality and particularity, and it was logical in the original sense of the word logics. The original sense of logics in the Aristotelian sense, logics is about commonalities and particularities. Logics, like dialectics, it was about extracting commonalities from particularities. And the Neoplatonic philosophers were logical, dialectical, scientific in applying commonalities and particularities to many gods that they believed in. That was a difference between Neoplatonic approach and Aristotle. Aristotle hesitated, to apply categories to the divine. Neoplatonists insisted on that. And the best person to do that was Porphyry of Tyre. Porphyry was a very interesting guy. Yes, he is the most famous producer of categories. He is the most famous interpreter of Aristotle's categories ever. The most popular one. His works were translated into all the languages of his time. His handbooks were used for teaching as in the schools and universities until modernity, essentially. And Porphyry, at the same time, was a staunch polytheist and anti-Christian. We can hardly find any other philosopher in antiquity who hated Christianity so much as Porphyry did. He really, really could not stomach Christianity. And yes, we know, the criticism of Christianity from Celsus, whom Origen opposed. But we don't know about the criticism of Porphyry because it was destroyed. It was so sharp, it was so biting that Christianity could not tolerate. It just destroyed everything that Porphyry wrote against Christianity, all those volumes that he produced. At the same time, this is a paradox, Christianity preserved the logical treatises of Porphyry. And that is really an amazing thing. Imagine someone who really hates you, really wants you to disappear, wants to destroy you, your belief, what is dear to you. The first impulse is to retaliate that person, to destroy everything that he has written, his legacy, his memory, everything. But Christians didn't do this to Porphyry, even though he deserved, from the perspective of fundamentalistic approach, to be forgotten, as many other, pagan philosophers who wrote against Christianity were forgotten, or Christians who, as many believed, wrote heretical doctrines were forgotten. But for Porphyry, despite his, hating Christianity, hatred to Christianity, he was reused in the Christian theology, and to the extent that if you go, for instance, to some Moldavian monasteries in modern Romania, on the frescoes outside, those pictures. All those beautiful monasteries, churches decorated outside, not inside, but outside. The walls outside are decorated. In some of those pictures, you can find the figure of Porphyry, standing, with saints and other philosophers. This is amazing. Someone who really hated Christianity is depicted among the saints of the frescoes in the monasteries. And moreover, more importantly, that his work has been preserved, treasured, and developed further by Christian theologians. The Christian theologians decided that what Porphyry wrote about the categories, about this kind of system of discerning between commonalities and particularities, is something valuable, something to be preserved, something to be treasured. And they actually preserved that part of Porphyry's work. And that part of Porphyry's work became the most important kind of background, scientific background for Christian theology. It became the backbone of the Christian theology. The entire Christian theology evolved around exactly the categories which had been produced by Porphyry. Christian theologians described their God. They described the incarnation. They described human beings on the basis of the distinctions which had been made by Porphyry. If you take the ultimate particularity described in the Christian theology and expressed in the Christian theology by the word hypostasis, that is the kind of Christian word for the ultimate particularity, any ultimate particularity, but it should be ultimate. This word was applied to God, to the Christian God, in order to explain how three particularities in the Christian God can coexist with one divinity. And this concept, not exactly the same, the word, but the concept was elaborated with perfection by Porphyry. And actually Christian theologians took these categories from Porphyry and applied them to explain the triune God, how the one God can be also the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They also explained how the triune God became a human being, a human personality in the person of Jesus Christ. They also explained this paradox of the incarnation through the categories employed by Porphyry and elaborated upon by Porphyry. An entire school of Christian logics was developed on the basis of the Porphyrian, or I would say Porphyrian Aristotelian categories. Just one example I'll show you. I have a book, a very rare book in my hands. It's a book by Theodore of Raith. He was a Sinaitic monk who lived on the Mount Sinai in the 6th century. Actually in the beginning of the 7th century. And he flourished in the beginning of the 7th century. So he wrote a treatise, the so-called Proparaskevi, the preparation, on the basis of Porphyry's logics, which became a kind of golden standard in Christian logics. And it has been published in this book. I really hunted this book. It's a very rare publication. You can hardly find it. It was very widely circulated in the second half of the first millennium, and in the first half of the second millennium. It's not circulated widely now. That's why I had to hunt for this book, really. But it was one of the most common logical texts, manuals in the Christian schools for centuries, together with Porphyry's. Also, it should be said that Porphyry's work And his interpretation of Aristotle and Aristotle's categories became widely spread throughout the Christian universe. They were translated into many languages of antiquity, like Syriac, Armenian, Arabic, and so forth. I just want to show you some other books that I have. Yeah. I hope you can understand everything, right? It's in Armenian. So this is the translation of the categories. That's an anonymous Armenian interpretation of Aristotle's categories, which were produced in the Middle Ages, and now it is also a Russian translation made in the 1960s or 70s. In the 1960s, in the Soviet time, imagine. So they produced the Russian translation of this Armenian text. So essentially, it's an interpretation of Aristotle's categories, and produced for the use of the Christian theologians. Or another book. Yeah, it's another wonderful piece of Armenian scholarship and logics, and of course you again understand everything. It's the analysis of the introduction of Porphyry into Armenian. This introduction is ascribed to David, a Neoplatonic scholar who worked in Alexandria. But the Armenians, for some strange reasons, perceive him as their national hero. They even have, a monument to David Anhat. They call him Anacht, the Invincible, David the Invincible, in the center of Yerevan, in a nice park, because they believe that he had kind of Armenian roots, and he contributed to the development of the Armenian theology, which was not exactly true. Nevertheless, he is a mythical person. Imagine. He's like a national legendary figure in the Armenian mythology, and he was an interpreter of Porphyry. And just for that reason, for that sake, he became a national hero in Armenia. So yeah, that's about yes, and also there were many translations of Porphyry and Aristotle's categories into Syriac language, Coptic language, all the languages of antiquity, and through the Syriac translations, the categories were disseminated in the Arabic world through the writings of such Christian Arabic writers as Theodor Abukura and others. And that's how the Muslim Islamic theology, especially the medieval Islamic theology of the Golden Age, which flourished in Central Asia in places like Samarkand, Bukhara, in the Persian Empire, it became the basis of actually Arabic theological thinking. It's a common kind of stereotype, that the West learned, about Aristotle from the Arabs, and the West produced its own scholasticism, in the Middle Ages. It's a bit of oversimplification, because the Arabs learned the logics from the Syrians through the Syriac translations primarily, and then in the West they read both Arabic texts and the Latin translations of people like Abu Sina or Avicenna, and the Greeks, because the Greeks still read all those texts in original. They constituted the backbone of the Greek paideia education in Byzantium and elsewhere. Essentially, this differentiation between commonalities and particularities, this differentiation constituted the backbone of education and of theology throughout, all the periods of the theological development up until our times, essentially. And I would argue that only with the emergence of modernity, and only with the emergence of the German dialectics, which substituted the Greek dialectics, the Aristotelian dialectics, we lost this framework of thinking, of this scholastic thinking. And of course, what contributed to losing this framework was, the witch hunting campaign against scholasticism. For some reasons and at some moment, scholasticism became a kind of a bad thing, anti-modern, retrograde, not cozy, not sexy, not funny, and everyone wanted to despise scholasticism. For many kind of secular thinking, scholasticism was a kind of a token of the old ways of theological thinking, and the secularists wanted to get rid of it. In the same way, kind of neo-Orthodox thinkers also began propagating the idea that scholasticism has to do, like in the Orthodox, in our Eastern Christian milieu, they started thinking that and propagating the idea, well, scholasticism is Western, that's why we need to get rid of it, because we want our genuine Eastern theology. And our genuine Eastern theology for them meant the theology free of scholasticism, which was a complete misunderstanding and the result of ignorance, because scholasticism was born in the East. It is the Eastern concept, it is the Eastern construct, and was replanted later on in the West. But it's a different story. I don't want to delve into it very much. I just want to make my point that yes, this kind of frame of thinking that had as its poles was framed by the commonality and particularity, shaped the entire thinking during the Antiquity, Middle Ages up to modernity. Well, even implicitly, even if we despise scholasticism, it continues to frame our thinking nowadays, because, well, nowadays it's a part of the scientific thinking anyway. And if you have some experience, some expertise in science, you cannot avoid it. And it helps actual theologians. That's why, for instance, for an example, most theologians in the post-Soviet milieu, in the post-Soviet countries, they have a background in science. I myself, I started my kind of scientific career in nuclear physics and in mathematics, so it helped me to, develop my own theology. And I think that exactly the scholastic, this categorical apparatus that still functions in the science, helps us theologians now to kind of rediscover it in our own traditions. The last point I wanted to make in my presentation on the evolution of thinking is that this category-based thinking was truly ecumenical and interreligious. Imagine this passage from paganism to Christianity, from polytheism to monotheism, which was extremely painful, which was extremely difficult, from the Greco-Roman religion, which was polytheistic and which was amalgamated in the Neoplatonic metaphysics, to Christianity, which was insistently monotheistic, and then this continued in Islam, which also pursued the same monotheistic agenda, as we all know. The kind of thing that survived all those transformations from polytheism to monotheism was logics, were categories, were these ideas, concepts of commonality and particularity. And exactly because of that, Porphyry was not neglected, was not condemned. His memory was not condemned, but he was treasured in the Christian theology because he actually was the best in articulating the categories, the logical categories. That's why Christians spared him and spared his memory. For the same reason, even though in Islam they did not very much like, of course, and they still don't like, Christian theology, they still value the categories. And the categories were transmitted peacefully and smoothly to Islam, to the Muslim theology. They also constituted the backbone of the modern Jewish theology, because the medieval Jewish thinkers, they used the same categorical apparatus. So essentially, in the era before ecumenism and before the interreligious dialogue, the categories of commonality and particularity constituted the platform for the interreligious dialogue. Also, I should say that as you know, in the first millennium, especially the Christian church was very much fragmented. There were many divisions and schisms, not fewer than in the second millennium, I would say. And there were ecumenical efforts to bring all those pieces of Christianity together. All those, who rejected Chalcedon or accepted Chalcedon, all those who were for the Council of Ephesus or were against the Council of Ephesus, who were, against that or this council and so forth. Those fragmented parts of Christianity, they tried to bring those parts together on the basis of categories. Because essentially the basis of in order to kind of reconcile those groups, they tried to work out a language, a common language. And that language was essentially the language based on the commonly perceived categories of commonality and particularity. So the common logical apparatus, the common taxonomies of beings expressed in the logics through dialectics, that explained commonalities and particularities, the categories of commonalities and particularities, they were used to reconcile different Christian groups who believed in different, sometimes irreconcilable theological doctrines. So essentially, I would argue that these categories that go back to Aristotle and Porphyry, they constituted the most effective ecumenical platform in the first millennium and the most effective interreligious platform for interreligious dialogue in the eras when such a dialogue was for many unthinkable. That would be my kind of conclusion for this introduction, and now I'll be happy to take your questions.